Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, I have seen that there are some monks writing down sermons given by the Buddha. Some of them were given long ago and have only been recited thus far.
Interesting. Writing them down is a very good way to preserve the teaching. Even if only a select few can read the texts, they are still the same no matter who is reading them. Interpretations may differ, but the written word doesn't change. Oral recitation, on the other hand, can be messy. Words are misremembered, sections are forgotten, or parts are purposefully changed. Thus, they don't always reflect what the Buddha actually said.
Indeed, but it is fascinating to see how much diversity in the interpretations of the teachings the oral tradition has led to. It's almost as though no two oral transmissions will be the same.
This is true. However, I have no doubt that when the sermons are written down, there will still be differing interpretations of the teachings, even if those interpretations are limited to what is written on the page and nothing else.
Indeed. I also wonder what will happen when the written texts are translated into another language. There are distant regions where even the elite do not know Sanskrit. Will they have to learn, or will the text have to be translated?
An interesting question, and one that I think is still open.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we are continuing our introductory series on Buddhism by discussing sutras. What is a sutra? What do I do with it? What sutras are best for learning the basics of Buddhism? We hope you enjoy. So, what is a sutra?
A sutra is a type of ancient Indian text. It is particularly associated with Buddhism, especially now, but not all sutras are Buddhist. Among ancient Indian texts, there are three broad and vague categories or genres into which most texts fall. They are 1. The Shruti texts, defined as that which is heard. These are texts that are believed to be divine revelations from the gods, and were heard by ancient sages thousands of years ago. Thus, an author is never attributed to these texts. 2. The Smriti texts, defined as that which is remembered. These are texts that recount history and myth, and thus, this category contains ancient epics like the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and the Puranas. 3. The Sutra texts. This is sometimes defined as that which is given, but that's not the literal meaning of the word sutra, whereas heard and remembered are the literal meanings of Shruti and Smriti, respectively. The Sanskrit word sutra, or its Pali counterpart sutta, translates to string, weave, thread, or that which is strung together. These texts are distinct from the previous two categories because they are transcripts or collections of what a person said in the past. Sutras are remembered, sort of like Smriti texts, because they're not authored by the person who speaks in them. And sutras are also heard, sort of like the Shruti texts, because the speaker in a sutra is usually a religiously significant figure. Thus, sutras are distinct from both of the previous categories, and they also have characteristics from both. Sutras first appear in the Brahmanas and the Aranyakas, which are both texts in the canon of Vedic literature and which predate the life of the Buddha by around 200 to 500 years. The sutras from this canon are condensed instructional texts, structured and designed such that they are easy to remember and easy to communicate from teacher to student. This contrasts with other Vedic texts written in narrative verse form or other structures which are meant to be recited ritualistically or are meant to be read and studied for content. To make this distinction between Shruti, Smriti, and Sutra clearer, imagine a book that contains a song about a computer, a history of computers, and a passage instructing somebody in how to use a computer. The part instructing somebody how to use a computer is the part that would be categorized as a sutra because it's instructional and meant to be communicated from a teacher to a student. It is not meant to be recited like the song, which would be the Shruti part, nor is it a recorded history of events, like the history portion, or the Smriti part. In the context of Buddhism, the meaning of the word sutra changes a little bit. Not every sermon given by the Buddha is a sutra, so we should explain the authorship of Buddhist texts and how we categorize them. During the life of the Buddha, and for around 100 years after, nothing in Buddhism was written down. The Buddha gave sermons and his disciples memorized, recited, and transmitted them orally. However, oral transmission is not very reliable. Good actors will simply forget or misremember portions, gradually drifting away from the original over time. Meanwhile, bad actors will edit or amend parts to suit their own purposes. Either way, the end result is that the original teaching is eventually lost. This unreliability is not necessarily only exclusively a bad thing, because it led to the development of a lot of unique Buddhist schools and sects with unique practices and perspectives. However, because of information decay, there was a push 1 to 2 centuries after the death of the Buddha to write the sermons down. Written word is static and cannot be edited, amended, or forgotten, as long as the original copy itself is maintained. As a result, it standardizes the teaching and its exact wording. So, at the Second Buddhist Council, around 100 years after Shakyamuni's death, Buddhists committed to writing down and recording the orally transmitted sutras of the Buddha. Pali was the spoken language of northern India at the time, alongside regional languages, but Sanskrit was the holy language of religious texts. So, sermons were copied in both Sanskrit and Pali, even though they had been orally recited in Pali or in Shakyamuni's native language of Magadhi. These linguistic differences matter because they speak to a difference in the use of the texts. Reciting in a regional language means that usage of a sermon was very localized and specific to a particular language group. It could not travel very far, and even if it did, people might not understand it. However, writing something down in a language that elites almost everywhere knew, such as Sanskrit, allowed the sermons to be read and be spread around geographically. This process started in around the 1st century BCE, when they were written on papers and scrolls made out of dried leaves. Because the environment and the technology available in ancient India was not conducive to the preservation of these texts, we have unfortunately lost many of the Sanskrit manuscripts to time and decay. However, we can be sure that they existed due to the provenance of texts translated into Chinese, where the technology for paper, preservation of documents, and the environment was much more conducive to preservation as well. These translated texts point to or reference a Sanskrit original, and scholars have little to no reason to believe that the author of these texts are lying. So, the sermons of the Buddha were recorded, and they were organized and standardized over time into the Pali Canon as we know it today, also known as the Tripitaka, or the Three Baskets. This canon contains texts of 3 categories: the Vinaya Pitaka, which contains sermons by the Buddha given to monastics explaining the rules and practices for being a Buddhist monk; the Abhidhamma Pitaka, containing treatises authored after the fact about the Buddha's teachings; and the Sutta Pitaka, containing sermons given directly by the Buddha. So in the Buddhist context, sutras and suttas are sermons that were given directly by the Buddha to a general audience, not just to the monks and nuns. These texts were allegedly heard and committed to memory by the Buddha's cousin and attendant, Ananda, who transmitted them after the Buddha's death and started the oral tradition. For more on Ananda, check out episode 74, Who is Ananda? Link in the show notes. As a result of his memorization, most sutras begin with the phrase, "Thus have I heard," referring to Ananda hearing it directly from the Buddha. Additionally, the Buddha is spoken of in the second person because Ananda is telling us what he was saying and doing. Later in history, around the 3rd century CE, texts which were likely not historical sermons given by the Buddha begin to appear. These were texts written by monks trying to insert their treatise into the canon by giving it the Buddha's voice. An example of a text like this is the Benevolent King Sutra. This is a sermon that purports to have been given by the Buddha exclusively to a gathering of kings and rulers on the topic of benevolent rulership. But scholars have sufficient evidence to conclude that this never actually happened, and that this text was authored by Chinese monastics with a specific political agenda in mind. A Western equivalent might be a church that comes out with a gospel of Jesus given exclusively to US presidents. No such thing ever happened or could happen, and whoever authored such a thing likely just has an agenda for how they think the US should be governed. Nevertheless, the Benevolent King Sutra is in the Chinese and Japanese canons, demonstrating that there are some canonical texts that proclaim themselves to be sutras when they technically aren't. However, their being apocryphal, or in other words, non-canonical, does not mean that they are necessarily wrong or bad. It just means that they don't have a Sanskrit or Pali equivalent.
What do I do with a sutra?
To begin with, I think that the best thing to do with a sutra is to read it for content. They are usually given with a frame narrative about the Buddha that surrounds a sermon on a particular topic. This framing will introduce you to the Buddha, his audience, and where he was. Then the sermon will discuss a particular Buddhist topic in great detail. Reading sutras is a great way to familiarize yourself with the Buddha, his environs, his disciples, and the rituals and practices of religious communities during his life. You will also meet mythical creatures and figures from Hindu mythology and cosmology, as well as other important Buddhas and deities in Buddhism besides the Buddha himself. You'll also encounter core vocabulary terms in Buddhism that are critical for understanding what Buddhism is all about. It may seem like a lot all at once,
and it kind of is,
but ultimately it is a huge and immersive learning experience. In reading sutras for content, it is critically important to keep an open mind and suspend your disbelief or any biases you may have. Stuff that is fantastical or impossible happens in them. For example, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra contains a portion where the Buddha's disciples all go visit a guy named Dhammacakkappavattana in his 10-foot by 10-foot hut. But when they enter, it's way bigger on the inside, and the Buddha's disciples are able to sit on thrones that are sometimes many thousands of miles high. This is but one example of something that is fantastical happening in a sutra, and it's a pretty tame example. It is important not to read this and immediately be like, "Psh, that could never happen, this is all BS." Whether or not the thing literally happened simply doesn't matter. There are more interesting questions to ask. Why is that impossible thing included in the text? What purpose does it serve? How would people reading this 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 years ago have responded to it? What does this inclusion tell you about Buddhism in general? That's a far more productive way to read. These are religious documents, and they are under no obligation to conform to consensus reality, just as in all other religions. Instead of trying to prove the text right or wrong to yourself, start by accepting that the text says what it says. And what it says is and has been incredibly important to people all across time, and it still is. You should figure out if you understand its content and the points it puts forth about the world or Buddhist doctrine. I think you'll find that understanding how and why the text says something is far more enriching than discounting the text because it contains events that you don't believe are possible. It's not nice to pick fights with Buddhists. Instead, try to understand Buddhism and Buddhists as best as you can, even if you don't believe it yourself. Some sutras are also commonly recited in whichever language the sutra happens to be translated into. The most commonly recited sutras are the Heart Sutra, the Contemplation Sutra, and the Lotus Sutra, all of which we have read and discussed, though we have only read a portion of the Lotus Sutra, since it's incredibly long. Reciting sutras has a very important place in Buddhist practice. Recitation invokes the teaching given in the sutra, which can have special ritual purposes. For example, the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, which could be a number of different things in the sutra depending on who you ask, is said to have a special power over our literal world. It can turn us into Buddhas and Bodhisattvas just by talking about it or spreading it around. Thus, reciting the sutra and invoking that teaching is considered a very meritorious act. Recitation also repeats the sermon, which is the best way to teach it to people. The monks at my local temple recite the Rishukyo, or the Prajnaparamita Nyayasata Panchasatika Sutra, for the purpose of repeatedly emphasizing and teaching the topic of the sutra to themselves. By repeating it enough times, they understand the teaching better and internalize it more. Sutra recitation can also serve as a prayer or a ritual act that creates merit or good karma, and purifies bad karma. Recitation of the Heart Sutra has been commonly used as a means of exorcising evil, protecting one from misfortune and illness, and helping or healing people experiencing some sort of calamity. In this, it is thought of sort of like a magic spell or incantation. My local temple also recites the Heart Sutra each week for these purposes.
Why are sutra writing styles so weird? There's a lot of repetition and odd phrasing.
This is a good question. The style and structure seem weird to us for a couple of reasons. For one, the sutras are being translated from a language and a cultural context that is distant both temporally and geographically from the 21st century American English cultural context. These texts were originally 2,000-year-old Vedic Sanskrit from northern India, or in some cases 1,800-year-old classical Chinese from southern China. Translating from these languages to English while carrying over all of the accompanying contextual and interpretive information is extraordinarily difficult, probably impossible. Of course, most words in these languages don't have a singular equivalent in English. As an example to demonstrate this point, Ventana is the Spanish equivalent to the English word window. This is a one-to-one equivalency with no information or context lost. By contrast, the Sanskrit word shunyata is far more complicated and deep than any one single English word. The closest we can come up with is the English word emptiness, so that is what most sutra translators go with. In choosing that word, so much information is lost, but it suffices for making the translated text readable. Another reason that the style and syntax is odd sometimes is that translators are trying to make the texts sound like the old translations of the Christian Bible. Such translations make use of grammatical techniques and syntax that nobody uses anymore. Few people even used them back then when they were originally translated. It was meant to be elite, high-level language as a means of showing respect and veneration to the subject matter. In an attempt to afford similar credibility to Buddhist texts,
and appeal to a Western audience who is already familiar with the Bible,
translators added lots of thys and thous, long sentences, and other grammatical techniques that are not used anymore. One of the most important components of sutra style and structure is centered around making the text easier to memorize and recite. There are lots of repeated phrases and even repeated paragraphs, and this serves to make it easier to commit them to memory or recite and transmit them to others. Even if it seems hard to memorize to us, it was usually easier in Sanskrit or Pali. Plus, monastics work much harder than everyday people to memorize sacred texts, so they'll memorize things far more effectively than us. I'd like to also speak a little bit about why the content and the plots of sutras may seem odd to us as Westerners. In sutras, you will often see a perfectly mundane plot where the Buddha just preaches something to somebody. But you'll also often see fantastical situations, like the Buddha replaces the sky overhead with translucent umbrellas in which you can see what appear to be parallel realities. Or the Buddha picks up his audience and is preaching to them thousands of feet in the air. Or the Buddha sends his disciples to different worlds to preach to all sorts of mythical beings that reside there. Of course, this is due in part to the cultural context and language being distant like I said before, but I also want to mention that stuff like this has a specific religious concept to teach. It is meant to demonstrate something to you about Buddhism, about what the Buddha is preaching, or about how Buddhism views the world around us. I challenge you to try and figure out those meanings and purposes as you read. Note that different sutras may contain wildly different lessons.
What sutras are the best for learning the basics of Buddhism?
Note that we have read and discussed all of the sutras that I'm recommending on the show. The first one I'll suggest will be the first sermon. The first sermon is known in Pali as the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which translates to the Discourse on the Turning of the Dharma Wheel. Don't stress over spelling that name. You can just look up the first sermon, and you will get the correct result. This is allegedly the first sermon that the Buddha gave after reaching enlightenment, and in it, the Buddha lays out the core introductory teachings of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. For more on that, join us next week, where we will reread and discuss it. In addition to the first sermon, I have 4 other recommendations. The first is the Heart Sutra. This is the most recited sutra in all of Buddhist history, and I think that it's important to actually read it and see why. It is around 1 page long in English, but it's very complicated and can take a lifetime to wrap your head around. I will include a link in the show notes. It presents a conversation between Avalokiteshvara and Shariputra, 2 core figures in Buddhism, on the topic of emptiness and the perfection of wisdom. Since it is so crucial to Buddhist ritual and practice, I highly recommend checking it out. In addition to the Heart Sutra, I recommend the Karaniya Metta Sutta, often shortened to the Metta Sutta, or the Sutra on how loving kindness ought to be done. This one is also short, but it very succinctly presents an explanation of how to do metta, or loving kindness, and what it actually is. In addition to that, I recommend the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, or the Great Sutra on the Establishment of Mindfulness. This sutra serves as the foundation for one type of Buddhist meditation, known as Vipassana meditation, or Samatha Vipassana meditation. This is a form of meditation practice that involves cultivating new perceptions on things through intense focus, and by slowing down the mind and body. This text is a bit longer, around 20 or so pages in English, but because meditation is so important to monastic Buddhist practice, and also what most modern Western people associate with Buddhism, I think that it's a good text to read as well. Finally, I recommend the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. This is a sutra that tells the story of the death of the Buddha. Though it may seem morbid, this is actually a very crucial text for several reasons. First, it is incredibly entertaining because it contains highly emotional and dramatic scenes between the Buddha and his cousin Ananda, who doesn't want him to die because he loves him as a cousin and as a teacher. Second, it is very instructive about how Buddhism ought to be practiced and how the doctrine ought to be understood when the Buddha has died. This anticipates the development of all sorts of interesting doctrines and rituals in Mahayana Buddhism that constitute a large portion of what we discuss on this show. These rituals and doctrines are specific to death, sacred spaces, the nature of the Dharma, and more. Third, it's also a very interesting story narratively because the Buddha knows that he's going to die, and he knows when. This creates an interesting tension between the Buddha and his disciples, and even though the Buddha gives specific instructions about what to do after he dies, there's still disagreement and even some small skirmishes over his remains. From there, let your interest guide you. There's no wrong answer for what to read. At that point, if you read carefully and look up stuff you don't understand as you go, you'll be equipped to read longer and more complicated sutras. Buddhism is the single largest producer of sacred words in world history, and so there is no shortage of text to read. I also encourage you to read Vinaya texts, Abhidharma texts, and treatises written by Buddhist thinkers later in history than Shakyamuni himself. Each of these will show you a different side of Buddhism, and they will all give you a new and interesting perspective on the teachings and how Buddhism is practiced in the world today. Check out the sutras and treatises we have read and discussed on this show, and also branch out to more materials besides what we have gotten into. As long as you read carefully and think critically, it will all be a positive learning experience.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of sutras. Join us next week where we will be continuing our introductory series on Buddhism and discussing the first sermon. What did the Buddha preach in the first sermon? What are the Four Noble Truths? What is the Eightfold Path? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. If you like our show and you want to support us, we ask instead that you send that support to Black families that have been displaced by the LA wildfires. You can find a directory of GoFundMe pages for these families in the show notes. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.